Hi, my name is Oliver Andrews, and today I'm going to be answering the question, where does the distinction lie between analog and digital? The reason why I'm researching this is because since joining this course, my workflow has become increasingly analog. I have found that it's had a significant effect on the way that I approach production, the way that I talk about production, and the overall sonic output. Through previous research that I've done, and also assignments, I've found that there is a lot more to talk about and think about with analog and digital recording. By looking at existing research articles and conducting interviews with people in the industry, I look to gain a greater understanding of how the gap between digital and analog is becoming narrower, and also that the discussion is not just technological. The first article I want to look at is by Austin Moore, titled All Buttons In, an investigation into the use of the 1176 FET compressor in popular music production. This article takes a very in-depth look at the 1176 and its characteristics. It also starts to compare it against other compressors, such as the Neve Portico 5043. So the main thing that comes to light when reading this article are the fact that the 1176 has a very fast attack and release, much faster than the Neve, and a very characteristic distortion, which is part of the reason why it's so widely used in the industry. Morse uses a lot of visual analysis and spectrographs so that he can put across how the 1176 acts in certain circumstances. For instance, when it's used on drums with a very slow attack and release, and also a very fast attack and release. All other sorts of different variations are discussed. This investigation is important because it shows the characteristics that digital plugin modelers are trying to recreate in the software domain. It also shows how visual analysis can paint a picture and inform in producers on when it's best to use the 1176. This sort of detail is something that I'll be looking to recreate in my main project, as visual analysis is very easily done. Also, to put a piece of equipment under quite vigorous testing can start to inform producers of when it is best to use certain bits of hardware and under what sort of circumstances. Also, what sort of parameters provide what sort of results. The next article by Kaiser, titled Analog Distinction, Music Production Processes and Social Inequality, is vital in adding social context to the debate between analog and digital. So what does Kaiser mean by distinction? Well, he states that distinction, in this case, is understood as the will to distinguish oneself from others. It can lead from cultivation of taste and establishes subtle differences among the cultural practices of society's members. To put this into context, a lot of music producers are using obsolete technology, for instance, old tape machines and tape cassettes. This starts to add a different texture to the music production and can also be seen as a form of protest against the norm. Another form of context to this is the fact that music producers nowadays can be seen to be working in studios with vast amounts of outboard equipment, yet their music practices are fully digital workflows. There is a general opinion that the equipment is there to solely entice artists into the studio. The actual mixing process is more than likely to be done completely in the box. An example of this is when you watch interviews with Andrew Sweps. So Andrew Sweps is someone that works exclusively in the box, yet he's always interviews in a studio that has a number of iconic or vintage outboard compressors and EQs. Furthermore, a very expensive mixing console that's analog. Another important aspect of this article is something that Kaiser states as the credibility gap. This is the difference in outcome of an emulations model and the outcome of a real system. Kaiser starts to further explain that though there is a difference in outcome and output between the two, there's also things like the haptic response that have to be taken into consideration. He puts, for instance, that the coldness of the plates, the potentiometers, the buttons and the faders, the soft and hardness of materials is something that cannot be recreated in the digital domain. So what sort of impact does this have on our music production? A study conducted by Mycroft and Patterson, titled The Activity Flow in Music Equalization, the Cognitive and Creative Implications of Interface Design, starts to take a deep and comprehensive look on how our workflow changes when working with physical analog EQs and digital software EQs. The research collected empirical data from a sample of participants, one group using Pro Tools equalizers and the other using traditional mixing desk EQs. Observing the empirical data gathered from the two groups of participants, it was noted by Mycroft and Patterson that when using Pro Tools, it was revealed that there was exploratory phase of discovering emerging features within the frequency content. This included widespread frequency sweeping, radical changes in gain and coarse adjustments to the bandwidth settings, and more precision and detail in adjustments to the equalizer controls. I know from my own practices that working with digital compressors can be really, really tricky, especially when trying to program them to get the elasticity, which is something that a lot of people want from compressors. So from this, it might be beneficial to invest in a MIDI controller or invest in the physical outboard equipment. Looking into workflow in a little bit more depth, a really good research article by Chamber Moran's titled The Generation Gap, Perception and Workflow of Analog versus Digital Mixing is a really good starting point to see how mixes that have been exactly recreated in the digital name from the analog can be perceived by people in the industry. The methodology used in this research paper is really well thought out. They took the voltage control measurements from an SSL duality and transferred them to an SSL duality plugin. Using different mixes from different genres, they use questionnaires to gather qualitative information to start drawing inferences. A very important aspect of this research is that they use different statistical formulas such as one-way ANOVA to dive deeper into the sample and see if there's any correlation or inferences between something like age. Two very interesting conclusions came from the data. One was that most engineers indicated that the tactility and physicality of the console enhanced their creativity and feeling of freedom in their workflow. Also, out of the four mixing engineers, three also mentioned that the analog duality sounded better and warmer and that it enabled a greater frequency depth and more breadth and was more exciting and forgiving than the SSL plugin. This is actually something I've noticed in my own practices. I'm able to challenge hardware more than I am their digital counterparts. This means that less attention is given to the visual metering, but more the sonic sounds that are coming from the analog equipment. This is in part due to analog clipping being quite desirable, unlike digital clipping. The next study by Ronan, Gunas and Rees looks into subgrouping and how professional engineers in the industry use subgrouping across genres. The reason why this article is used is not only because it gives an insight into different workflows, but also that they didn't account for analog and digital to start being discussed. Using their methodology of questionnaires and interviews, also collecting data from people's digital mixes that have been handed in, means it's a very useful research paper to use as a foundation for future studies. Amendments can be made in the questionnaire to allow for analog and digital discussions. Furthermore, video evidence of how engineers mixed in analog environments can also be used as empirical data. This is to see if the subgrouping methods between analog and digital are the same. An interesting quote from this article states that due to the lack of subgrouping literature, we employed inductive thematic analysis, where survey responses allowed us to develop themes not directly related to the question. This is quite an important statement, as it means that the researchers are finding themes where there's no literature to back up the information that they're getting. This means that they're drawing new general laws on how people work, whether across genres, or how effects and processes can be used in different instances of subgrouping. This is really important when doing my own research, because just because there isn't literature in backing up the finding doesn't mean that the data is corrupt or not correct in any way. In fact, it can mean that the research has brought to light new inferences. The next Two articles using this pilot study are sound on sound articles. The first one from Lambert actually does quite in-depth interviews with CEOs of plugin companies. For instance, an interview with Colin McDowell, who is the CEO of McDSP, brings to light the opinions of people in the industry. For instance, statements like anything that can be created in hardware can be created in software. Also, Colin talks about how software is a much more fluid engineering method and by its very nature more flexible than fixed hardware design. Though this is really important information, one must be aware that it can be biased. The guy is a CEO of a digital plugin manufacturer, therefore he's not going to play down his own company. The next article by White actually has a very interesting interview with Joe Bryan from Universal Audio. He's an engineer and has worked on modelling the 1176. So something that's really interesting that was talked about is something that fixes into more study on the 1176. Bryan explains that the 1176 is a very difficult process to model because of its feedback structure, and the attack time is actually less than one sample. In a mathematical realm where everything is quantized to a single sample, you have to play very complex mathematical games to replicate that. So here we're starting to investigate the credibility gap again. We're starting to dive into exactly how people modeling digital plugins have problems recreating their original counterparts, especially the 1176 because of its fast tack and release times. The method of research conducted for this pilot study was to use interviews with people in the industry to find out their opinions on digital and analog music production, to see if there's any opposing opinions or any neutral ground where everyone thinks the same. From these interviews, I want to start to develop sub-questions and see if there are any more academic fields that start to tie into this discussion. One of the main factors of using interviews to collect data for this research pilot study is to gather lived experience. Lived experience is a very good way of exploring multiple perspectives in a wider social context. We can also use interpretivism to see how quite personal opinions can be generalized to a wider population. The first interview conducted is with Michael Johnson. Michael Johnson worked at Britannia Row and Factory Records and recorded New Order's Blue Monday. Here he's talking about how the advent of digital actually had the opposite effect on his workflow that he thought it would.
We thought computers would speed things up when they came into studios, studio computer and the SSL, but no, it just gives you more options, so you spend loads more time exploring options.
Right.
So no, it doesn't speed it up, it takes longer.
This next clip shows how Mike Johnson has started to highlight the difference in ergonomics and features that model plugins have from their original counterpart.
It's not like the bus compressor on SSL, and it's not like the channel compressor. It's got much more control than either of those. And I don't really use it because it's an SSL emulator. I just use it because I like it.
The next interview was done with Simon Jones, who is the bassist from The Verve. Here he starts to talk about how affordability is playing a big role in the reason why he's going back to working with analog equipment.
Well, I'm lucky to have that experience, but I'm enjoying this period in my life of recording bands and still learning. Do you know what I mean? And now going back to analog and being able to buy a clone of something that's a couple of £100 because it's basically Behringer have bought everyone out.
I know,
Make
yeah.
it affordable, which is amazing because I think it needs everything else about the music industry so fucked that being able to have that luxury is just an amazing thing. Being able to buy record music on a laptop's an amazing tool for a musician that we didn't have. You'd use a 4-track tape machine back in the early 90s. We were doing, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's what our demos, ideas were done on, really, but taking it.
He also talks about how the music industry has led people to be drawn towards a more DIY way of producing music.
That was as much as the decline in music industry, not music, the music industry, it's also been a fucking huge catalyst for people, whether it's DJs or people immersed in the culture, to go and create music. Do you know what I mean? And that's like that's massive. You can't, people complain about the music, isn't it?
The last bit of this interview that I'm going to show is when I asked Simon if there is any difference between analog and digital. Is there something that digital just isn't giving you, that you know from past experience that analog might be able to fill?
No, you know what? No, no, because like Nick brought up the Clark Technic to my studio, and we A/B'd it with the Waves plugin, and we could get the Waves plugin to sound like the 1176, and we could get the 1176 to sound like the Waves plugin. So no, it's the answer.
The third and final interview was done with Russ Cottier. He's someone that's worked at Parr Street in Abbey Road and has recently designed a MIDI control surface for the Mixbus door. So here he's talking about how a more haptic response for him sounds a lot different than just using a mouse in the software doing it.
About Mixbus?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Your main bus.
Okay, so Mixbus sounds different to me when I'm using the Ruco to when I'm using a mouse.
Right, okay.
That's totally ridiculous because it's obviously the same. It's digitally identical. But
the final clip that I'm going to use from this interview kind of ties into what Simon Jones was talking about with affordability, but puts it in a bit of a different light and comes from a different perspective.
Like 50 years down the line, if we can't make for 100 quid what was, the equivalent of £1,000 50 years ago, then we're in a bad situation. If we can't make microphones for £10 now that were £1,000 in 1953, then what the hell have we been doing for the past half a decade? 7.
So where does the distinction lie between analog and digital? Well, the research in this pilot study has shown that it isn't just technological. There is a huge sociological aspect to the analog and digital debate in general. One thing that's really important is the fact that computers nowadays are very affordable, and the software is very affordable too, sometimes even free. With the music industry being the way it is nowadays, people are a lot more entitled to produce the music that they love in their bedrooms on cheaper equipment. But as discussed with Simon, analog is now becoming a lot more affordable. For instance, you can spend £200 on a bit of hardware that mimics the 1176 instead of buying the original that costs thousands. Something that's very interesting though, when interviewing music producers, like for instance Mike Johnson and Russell and Simon, the main consensus is that digital can do everything that analog does. But when looking at a research paper like that of Chamber and Moran's, it's actually comes to light that music producers do prefer working on analog. I think the future of analog and digital distinction is absolutely going to be hybrid working environments, with everything becoming cheaper and cheaper. I understand that this is already practiced. There are many people working in hybrid working environments, but I mean more for the bedroom producer that may just use a laptop and 2 speakers. So how does this pilot study fit into the summer project? Well, a lot of the research articles that we looked at actually use something called ABX testing, which is forced choice. So this this gives a way to gather qualitative information. But what do I mean by forced choice? Well, if I have something that is, say, an analog recording and something that is a digital recording, say A or B, I can use X as the variable. So X can be either A or B. So someone will listen to A, someone will listen to then B, and decide whether X is A or B. This is a really good way of seeing if people can actually find the difference between analog and digital, because if their scores are low, it means that there's a degree of randomness in their answers. So other bits of research are online surveys, interviews and questionnaires. We've seen from this study how good and how powerful interviews are in gauging the music industry as a whole. Online surveys are really, really good. And for instance, Russell Cartier said that if any future online surveys need to go out to other people in the industry, he can help with that, therefore producing a kind of a snowball sample, which is brilliant. So we've looked at research-led practices here, research-led papers. But I also want to start to incorporate practice-led research in any further studies. I think this is really important because in creative arts, it does kind of give different inferences and produce different results. So in the study, there is a massive sociological aspect to the analog and digital debate, or the distinction between analog and digital. And there's a lot of kind of secondary articles that can fold into sociological studies, essentially becoming a critical practitioner. So Posthumous has some great quotes and starts to really dive into the sociological field and start to provide a lot of in-depth information to how we can start to explain the way that social groups act, social groups kind of appear, and cultures appear, and also the effect that can have on a wider and general population. One thing that hasn't been discussed that much in this research is the philosophical side of music. An article by Kvift, which is Digital Sampling and Analog Aesthetic, is really important into kind of how we can view analog and digital outside of, ones and twos and tape, for instance. He starts to talk about semiotics, particularly in music. So he says, for instance, that music notation in itself is digital, but if we had, music notation and vibrato, each person is going to play that vibrato slightly different, which is the more analog aspect of it. Another kind of secondary article that's really good is Bouillard's Simulacra and Simulation. Again, as a secondary article, but he starts to discuss something called the hyperreal, which I think is quite important when we use plugins. Especially plugins, we start to think that we're using the real 1176 and we talk about it in the same way. So I'd like to investigate that a little bit more and start to kind of draw some philosophy about why we talk and why we think that we're using 1176s, when in reality they are just graphical user interfaces and bits of code. So for the main study to be done over the summer, I will be looking more in depth into the credibility gap and how that can be extended into other kind of academic fields like those discussed in this pilot study, for instance, sociology and philosophy. And to do that, I'm going to be kind of expanding the resources that I have and looking here at other academic works. For instance, Adams and Lawrence, their research methods, statistics and applications, which is really gives a full overview of how to do statistical analysis and what that statistical analysis means. Furthermore than that, there is The Verge, Any Sound You Can Imagine, which gives a real detailed account of the music industry, how music's marketed, what that means for the user, and things like affordability, like we discussed in the interviews. Also, Poetics of Rock, which is an incredible book, and looks at the inner workings of quite iconic studios and also the practices of people in the industry. So I hope this has shed some light on the distinctions between analog and digital. I've thoroughly enjoyed working on this, and especially the interviews with people in the field. It's funny kind of how a lot of what they were saying was falling into the already existing research, but there were some gaps or credibility gaps between them. So thank you very much.